Hi all, let's have a look at one of the many amazing Magnus Carlsen games played recently at the Grenke Chess Classic. They are extremely intriguing games, some of them, especially from a positional perspective. So this game was against Levon Aronian in round 7 of the Grenke Chess Classic. d4 for Magnus, we have knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3 sidestepping the mainline Nimzo Indian, or rather the Nimzo Indian. It's not really mainline. Knight f3 is the preferred choice going into Queen's Indian territory nowadays, it seems. d5, knight c3, d takes c4, e4, and now bishop b4. So this is the Ragozin Vienna variation. Now with this absolute pin, white reacts with a relative pin on that knight. c5, we have bishop takes c4, c takes, knight takes d4, and black volunteers the dark squared bishop. So this has all been seen before, very theoretical line. Up until this point, queen a5. This really got me extremely curious, just from an opening theory perspective. Magnus actually retreated the bishop here. More usual in this position is bishop b5 check, with the idea of denting sometimes black's pawn structure like this. Bishop takes, g takes is the usual move, and after queen b3, this continuation is thought to be about even. Here, by the way, if there was queen takes c3 check, then this actually favours white. This scenario, it's crushing, it's winning the rook there. Black's got to be extremely careful in this variation. So bishop d2, very interesting. So bishop b5 has been seen a lot before. Also, there's on move 10, bishop takes f6. This is thought to be generally about equal, quite exotic. Black's king residing in the centre, but it's thought to be okay. It's been seen before. So this is a really unusual, rare move, bishop d2. So maybe this caught Levon Aronian off guard a bit, having to improvise. And you might think the immediate question, isn't this pawn hanging? If it's taken, it seems queen g4 is pretty good, double attacking e4 and g7. So for example, knight takes, we can actually not play king takes here, but queen takes g7, it seems, is plausible. So for example, rook f8, now king takes, and this ends up being a small edge for white. So a very, very intriguing variation after knight takes e4. If white just castles instead of queen g4, it seems as though black is getting a reasonable position, might even have a small edge technically. So anyway, so bishop d2, it seems as though, yeah, this pawn might be trouble, mainly because of queen g4. So we have black actually ignoring that for the moment, and now that's officially protected with queen e2, the e4 pawn. And there is potentially a threat of e5 here, and then maybe looking at h7 later, that soft spot if the knight's kicked away. So there are two ways of addressing this. Because the queen's already looking at e5, knight bd7 is possible here to lock down white's e5. But in the game we have e5. In a way, this is kind of more committal, and it's also saying that the bishop might be coming around this end of the board. You see, it does weaken some light squares, and you might have thought the fianchetto instead on this side might be good. Because structurally, if we look at this position structurally, black could be looking forward to the c-file, pressure on the c-file. White's pawns are a bit fragmented. On the other hand, there's another road here, pressure on the b-file. Maybe a kind of minority attack exists from a sort of pawn structure perspective. If this pawn can jettison itself, attack these two guys later. So it's interesting structurally. So anyway, e5, knight b3 hits the queen moves back, and now white castles, and now we see this decision of the bishop coming over to this side of the board with bishop g4. It seems plausible knight bd7. For example, playing like this seems plausible, even if without a fianchetto. And it looks as though this scenario where black goes after the a4 pawn is perhaps dynamically balanced. Instead, if b6, and let's try the fianchetto here, It seems as though this should be okay after bishop b5. White again is maybe getting a small edge, but the only imbalance in this position is the knight and bishop against the two knights. It seems that the pawn structure is kind of symmetrical. Well, okay, white's got a bit more space, but overall perhaps white has a small edge there. So interesting decision though, putting the bishop over here, bishop g4. So the bishop swinging round. Now instead of moving, it was a counterattack on c4. Of course it's terrible to take this here. Structurally that would be a total wreck for white, and even losing e4. So bishop d5 was played. Not minding a knight takes d5 later, which does give white the e4 square. And in fact, well, actually knight takes d5 was played immediately. E takes, bishop h5, and now c4. And you might think, let's get the syntactical tactical issue out of the way first here before looking at the semantics of the pawn structure here. If queen takes c4, then just rook fc1, and there's a back row mate issue. So that's one for the puzzle book for this game at chessworld.net. You want to check that out. So that's just the back row mate disaster trap. But from a blockading point of view, it's interesting that in theory black has a comfortable blockading point. So this setup, say black has this setup with this blockade, I guess the fun for white is lifting or pressurizing or torturing that blockade in some way, or even extracting a pin from it. And I'm saying that with the benefit of hindsight. It's interesting how play can revolve quite a bit around this c5 blockade square subsequently in this game. Because this is the structural aspect, you know. If also, by the way, that pawn on b6, if it was knocked out of the way with this kind of structural attack, you can imagine that these pawns here would be quite mobile and central to connected pass pawns in the center. So that structural transition, if ever this pawn is swapped off with the a pawn, you can see that the central pawns would be quite dangerous. So it seems a lot of the story now of this game is about the c5 blockade. So we see knight d7, rook fc1. Okay, that's kind of interesting. There was also a post-mortem view of this game where rook ac1 was mentioned, and maybe a5. Here, white doesn't necessarily, it seems, have to play a4, but which was mentioned by Magnus Carlsen. Bishop e1 might be technically possible, parking the knight here, and then this position is a small edge, or even a significant edge for white. So without touching the a pawn, because you know once we touch the a pawn, it might be some liability at some point. So rook fc1 though was interesting. We have b6, so that blockade square is the story of the game really at the moment. How is it going to be contested by both sides? The argument for black's position, it looks in a way quite comfortable, with this bishop in a way having quite a nice diagonal, interfering with natural looking rook moves. So if a5 had been played instead, a4, let's examine this for a moment. With queen e3, so with a view for c5 at some point, rook c3, this kind of scenario, you can see the bishop might actually reroute to a3. So this is actually okay for white. It's quite nice for white. Despite, there's pressure around the dark squares generally, not just the c5 dark square. Here, also, b6 is plausible. So b6 straight away, a4, a5. On bishop g6 here, just to get a view on the c5 story, bishop e3. Now let's say the committal knight c5. Knight takes, and white can wriggle round the bishop here with rook a2, sidestepping b1. And white actually is doing quite nicely there. It seems black's really quite on the defensive in this scenario, with the dark square bishop hitting c5 continually. Battery option, and maybe using the b file a bit. Maybe this rook sidesteps the bishop, joins on the b file. So black's really passive there. Alternatively, on rook ab8, this could be a scenario with a5, trying for a favourable structural transition, and this nifty stuff with queen a2 becomes possible to kind of, in a way, contest not just c5, the blockade point, but also the dark squares generally, have a real fight on the dark squares here. And this looks very promising for white, these kind of scenarios. This is just a fictional scenario where we have the two connected pawns in the centre, which are blockade for a moment, but white's got an edge there. So anyway, a5, we see queen f2, yeah, looking at c5 square, queen d6, bishop e3, battery against c5 and b6, bishop g6, queen d2. Now, in post-mortem, it was mentioned, this had the notion that c5 is like teasing the possibility of c5, which might mean knight takes and then knight c6. There are some tactics which interfere with this technically, but it kind of induced maybe a committal pawn move from black, f6. If queen b2 immediately, which was mentioned, Magnus Carlsen expressed some concern for bishop d3, which is one of the only forcing moves in the position, that c4 pawn attacked, and say knight d2, queen g6, with the idea h5, h4, with counterplay potentially, but maybe rook c3, and the artificial looking rook a3 sidesteps the bishop and is able to put pressure on b6. So this position, maybe even this is possible. So there's still black's b6 pawn can be tortured a little bit. So white overall should be having a small edge there. So anyway, we have queen d2, a kind of teasing threat. The threat is stronger than the execution, or often stronger than the execution, as Nimzovich would say. So yeah, it kind of induces this f6. Now, why is f6 a major problem? Also, isn't f6 kind of in advance of queen b2? If queen b2 hitting c5, black might want sometimes knight c5 without e5 being vulnerable. So why is f6 so bad? White hasn't got a light square bishop either to kind of celebrate the light square weaknesses. So is it affordable for black to play this? As an alternative, if h6, c5, this position, it seems bishop d3 is an important tactic here, with this temporarily exploiting the queen being the only thing protecting a5. And here, this is okay for black. Black's actually getting a nice position with definite counterplay. And here, if knight takes c5, this way of playing things, again, bishop d3 crops up with c4, and black again is doing absolutely quite well there. So yeah, sometimes it seems as though c5 isn't such a big deal. So anyway, f6, we have queen b2, and now rook c7. On bishop d3 here, hitting c4 is like the only threat to consider really in the position. Knight d2, knight c5. Is black getting a good grip here? The thing is, the interesting thing about this blockade is tactically this pin is really annoying. Queen a3. This is celebrating the act of unblockading, or trying to make the most out of black having quite predictable pieces around the blockade square. So arranging stuff tactically and torture scenarios. Knight e4, and then actually it's the b6 pawn which it seems as though this is quite nice for white, that white could even afford an ending like this, where say the king came up to protect d3 and then basically b6 could be tortured. So white's definitely in the driving seat there in the endgames, so it can even afford this, it seems, potentially with a big advantage. So we see actually, instead of this forcing move, we see rook c7, and now knight d2, knight c5. So using the blockade, allowing this kind of pin. Like in general, one doesn't like to go into self pins. On king h8, though, let's have a look what white could do. This is just a fictional scenario if the blockade isn't made use of. Rook c3, queen a3, yeah, okay, the pin now. And then using the pin, and then let's say this scenario where white can build up, eventually take on c5, get this structure and have control over the b file and start winning material like that with a big advantage. That's just a fictional scenario of what could happen structurally. Yeah, so it seems there's an undertone of significant long-term structural threats here. We have Queen A3. Another, just to paint a bit more about the picture here, if Rook AC8, just doubling rooks, then offering the exchange of queens here would seem this is a plausible kind of thing, even losing the A4 pawn, because knight E4 is pouncing without any F5, putting pressure on like the D6 square. Knight D6 has to be addressed, and then this is quite comfortable for white. There's lots of compensation here. It's a huge position for white. So anyway, knight C5, we have going into that self pin. Now Rook C3, F5, another committal decision, weakening kind of E5. If this committal decision isn't played, say King H8, here is another fictional scenario. Working around this bishop to try and celebrate the backward pawn on the semi-open file. The rook could go to B2, we can install on B5, torture the pin a bit, and then fragment black's pawns and C pawns. Black ends up more passive than white, and you can see that the C5 is an issue as well as the B file here, and maybe to increase the advantage here in this fictional scenario, white would open up a second front for the bishop to have even more dark square access. For example, at D6, this would be quite torturous, and that could be a disaster ending for black, using all of the positional trump cards. Tactics flow from superior positions, but probably opening up the second front would be needed. So anyway, F5 was played, not waiting for stuff like that. So Rook E1, and black's really changing the pawn structure voluntarily in this game. E4, is it leaving just simply a weak pawn? Well, Magnus cashed out now. This does seem as though it's pretty committal, sacking a pawn basically. Maybe Levon Aronian thought this was okay. But it seems tactically here, this is a big problem for black. It looks pretty dangerous. Okay, so the rook's attacked. Sorry, I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at this more. So the rook's attacked. It goes back. If rook takes c4 here, then knight d2 hits the rook, hits the queen. Winning the exchange here is very nice, of course, for white. So rook cc8, h3. So a pawn up. Is it necessarily terminal? Well, we see here queen c7. On h6, there's actually knight d6. Would seem, hang on, no, h6, knight d6 is not necessarily a killer move, by the way. There looks to be a tactic with rook e8, but black can actually just give up the queen and have this scenario with the two rooks, and it should be even. So it's not necessarily to punish h6, knight d6, but white has a pleasant position. There are other ways to play in this position. We see anyway queen c7, knight d2, rook e8, and now white does go into that 7th rank. Again, I love Nimzovich talking about the 7th rank. It's very, very powerful to get a rook on the 7th, because statistically there's lots of pawns to attack. Well, here there's 2 at least. Queen e3, looking at things like queen e5. So black plays rook c7 to try and address that before it's too late. Rook e6, keeping possession of that e file, looking at b6, double attacking. Well, it's just too much here, isn't it? Because b6 is such a fixed, exploitable looking target. It's shielded for a moment, but now queen b3, and now what's the trick to defend b6? I mean, black's out of tricks and actually ends up resigning here. So it really is an advanced positional struggle. I felt I needed to look at the game, analyse it, and then come back to it, as I did 2 days later. I'm not really sure, with such games of such high, subtle positional quality, it does justice to them, to be honest, to sort of try and present them a day very shortly after they were played. I mean, maybe that's just me, but I really did find this is a highly finessed game, an opening novelty, getting this kind of blockading scenario, which maybe Magnus had done some research about it, that really, in this particular configuration, it's fine to let black kind of set up camp on c5, because there are ways to kind of fight against that on the dark squares generally, not just the c5 dark square, but the dark squares generally, as the variation showed. And the b6 pawn was looking like a liability through many of the variations of the game as well. Okay, if you enjoyed this game video, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly. Become a member at chessworld.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on variations covered in this and other games from the improved menu puzzle books option, which has a link to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell, really appreciated. Thanks very much. I might bolt on an addendum actually for a little puzzle book of this game. Thanks very much. Hi all, this is from chessworld.net. I've just created the puzzle book for this game analysis. So if you go to Improved Puzzle Books, you'll see actually quite a few new ones. So this is the very latest. I'll put the thumbnail soon after this video is uploaded. But you can see also Magnus Carlsen throughout his career. There's a big whopping one to check out from how he finished great sacrifices and finishes. So check that out as well. But this one, let's have a look now. We can apply a filter, which I will, just for clear advantages and mates. And let's see how many we get. Probably, okay, 7. So white play for a clear advantage here. This is, I think, with king f1. A bit of a test of opening theory. And then we've got a big tempo for knight c7. That was an easy one, wasn't it? So there's a bit of sharp theory in this one. Here, this was a terrible idea. F takes. It was just, in theory, we can just take here. And then take here, big advantage. Here, white play for a clear advantage. Oh, I think this looks tricky. I don't think I remember this. What's the hint on this? I'm going to go with the hints. Hang on. Nope. Okay, I think I'm going to give up on this. Bishop e1. Oh, the idea was to park the knight on d2. Oh, I should have known that. And then maybe bishop f2. Okay. So here, white play for a clear advantage. e5 looks tempting. Nope. Bishop e3. Can we just take on c5? Torture c5. Not like that. I think queen b2 hits. Okay. Hint. Oh, sidestep the bishop. All right. Here, black to play for a clear advantage. I think the problem here with white going for a5, let's have a look here, was bishop d3, this tactical bishop d3, and then c4 and black. It seems, you know, it's an issue for white, this position. Yeah, d5 is weak. It's shielded by the bishop on d3. Okay, not at the moment, knight e7 check, but later, you know, that could be a problem for white, this scenario. So that was a clear advantage for black in that case. This 6-1, okay, what was it taking here? It was knight b3. Nope. Rook b3. I might need a hint. No, can we double here with that bishop not glaring? Nope. Rook b5. Hint. Queen b2 hitting e5. All right. e5 is actually dropping off there, it seems. Yeah, because the double attack on b6 and e5, of course. It reinforces actually some of the subtleties as well of the variations we covered. If you check these puzzles out, what am I saying? Okay, it carries on. Hint: queen takes e5. Okay, it carries on. Yep. And the last one. So here I think knight d2 was the retreating move, hitting the rook, and then we can just win the exchange, and then take the 7th rank. Okay, so apply whatever filters you want, and you'll kind of revise some of the finesses of what we covered in the video. So I hope you check that out, and the other books especially much more interesting puzzles sometimes in the specialist kind of puzzle books to check out there, which includes Magnus Carlsen. Also, I did Kramnik recently in tribute to Kramnik, and there's also a Bobby Fischer one. So these are the 3 big ones which have been added recently to check out. Okay, thanks very much.